of 2013, a young woman named Melissa finally moved out of her mother's house and got her own place across town. For the first few months she was living there, she never noticed anything strange. But about 3 months into living there, things started to get a little bit weird. It started with a whole bunch of hang-up calls where someone from different numbers would call, she'd answer, and she could hear them breathing, but they weren't saying anything. And then she started getting these huge bouquets of flowers delivered to her front step, but they were delivered from anonymous. Then after that, she started noticing things in her kitchen and her living room were going missing. Things like plates, cups, drink coasters, salt shakers, forks and knives, little things, but since she lived alone and she was the only one moving these things, they really stood out. Melissa had this habit that every time she went to bed, she would unplug her TV. She had this irrational fear if she didn't do that, that it would spark a fire and her house would burn down in the middle of the night. So she was pretty obsessive compulsive about always making sure the TV was unplugged before she went upstairs to bed. And so one night around the same time she's getting these hang-up calls and there's flowers being sent to her door and things are going missing, she unplugs her TV and she goes up to bed. The next morning she gets up and comes downstairs and the TV's plugged in again. She convinces herself that, well, she must have forgot to unplug the TV. As rare of an event as that is, it has to be what happened. And so that night she unplugs the TV and remembers looking directly at the plug, confirming that yes, I've unplugged the TV. And then she puts it down and looks again at the outlet. It's not plugged in. It's definitely not plugged in. And then she goes upstairs to bed. The next morning when she walks downstairs, she had the sense of dread that when she turned the corner, because her TV was right at the bottom of the stairs, that when she turned the corner, it would be plugged in again and her worst nightmare would come true, that something is happening on my first floor when I'm asleep at night. And as she comes down the stairs and turns the corner, what does she see? The TV is plugged in again. She's horrified, but has no idea what to do. It's not some malicious act. And she's telling herself, well, maybe I forgot again, but then she's like, no, I remember last night staring at the plug. I definitely unplugged it. And so she flies around her first floor to make sure, one, everything is locked, but two, no one else is in here. And when she's satisfied that, yup, it's empty down here, and two, everything is locked, she sits there thinking, well, now what do I do? Do I call the police and say, someone's plugging in my TV? You know, she can't do anything. And it was at this point that Melissa developed a very real fear of her first floor. And she began going to bed so early at night because she could not be on that floor when it started to get dark. And so imagine living alone, being afraid of going down to your first floor, how scary it would be at night when you're laying in bed, your door's shut, and any noise you hear in the house, you're going to attribute to your first floor. And so Melissa was living this absolutely wretched life where she's scared of everything outside of her bedroom. And so with that as context, Melissa goes to bed one night super early, probably like 3 o'clock. The sun's not even down yet, but she's upstairs. But eventually it does get dark outside and she still has not fallen asleep. And so she sits up in bed and she turns on the TV. And right away, the channels on the screen start to change. And she's thinking, oh, I must be laying on the remote. But then she remembers the remote's in my hand. And so she's looking at the remote and then she's looking at the TV. She's not touching her remote. And the channels are still cycling. Now, Melissa had what's called a skybox, which means her downstairs TV was connected to her upstairs TV and vice versa. If one was changing the channel, in real time, the other changed the channel. And so as she's looking at her remote and not touching it, and looking at the screen as the channels are changing, it dawns on her that someone downstairs is changing the channels. And so frozen in fear, all she can think to do is turn off her TV because that's the one function that does not have any impact on the other TV. So she turns the TV off. And so in total darkness, in a house she's already terrified of, she is straining her ears to try to hear some sign that this is either someone's down there flipping through channels, or this is nothing, and I just happened to turn the TV on when the skybox was malfunctioning. And as she's sitting there, all she can hear is her own breathing, and she can feel the pounding of her heart in her chest. But she doesn't hear any sounds in her house. She doesn't hear the TV on. She doesn't hear footsteps, doors opening, none of that. It's silence in the house. So after what probably felt like an eternity, she just grabbed a pillow and clutched it in front of her and put her head into the pillow and just laid like that until she eventually fell asleep. The next morning when she gets up, the sun is out and it's this huge relief because suddenly with the sunlight pouring in the windows, it was like the house wasn't scary anymore. And she's telling herself, you know what, that had to have been just some anomaly with the skybox. I bet I go downstairs and the TV's unplugged. And so she goes downstairs and the TV is unplugged. And so that for her kind of confirms that, okay, the paranoia is getting to me. I'm losing my mind a little bit. I gotta tell someone what's going on. And so as it happens, that day she was going to a family birthday party. And so when she gets there, she pulls her older brother aside and says, here's the strange things that are happening in my house with the skybox and all this. And at first, he looked at her like, really? This is what's going on? You're seeing ghosts in your house? But when she really focused on the specific things that were happening, like the plug going back into the wall 2 separate times, and then the skybox thing. So the TV is kind of wrapped up in the weirdness that's been happening in her house and the missing items in her house. And so for the brother, it all kind of added up to, okay, this does seem a little bit weird. And he offered to live with her for a few days and just see it for himself. And as they're talking, their younger brother happens to walk by, overhears the conversation, and says, oh, I'll stay there too. For 4 days, the 2 brothers lived on the first floor of Melissa's house, and they don't see anything, they don't hear anything, it's completely ordinary. And Melissa at first was reassured, but then started to think, does that mean whoever's been doing this stuff is watching my house really closely and knows that I have, protection at my house right now and they're staying away? Does that mean I'm being watched really closely? And so finally, when her brothers are getting ready to leave after the 4th day, she was practically begging them to stay. She couldn't stand the idea of staying in this house. Her brothers reassured her that she had nothing to worry about, but if she experienced anything weird, anytime, any day, just call or text and they would be there in a heartbeat. Although she did not feel reassured, it was starting to get late, at least by her standards. It was like 3 o'clock, so the sun's getting close to going down, so she needs to go upstairs. So she goes back in her house and does like 20 trips around her house to confirm everything is shut, everything is locked, no one's in the house, everything is safe, and then she goes upstairs to bed. But like most nights, she was so scared of everything outside of her bedroom door that she couldn't sleep. And as she's laying there in utter silence in her room, she hears the unmistakable sound of her back door opening. And she hears footsteps walking through her first floor. And then she hears the TV turn on. And her brothers have been watching her TV last, and they had the volume set really, really high. So as soon as the TV went on, it blared all through the house. And immediately the TV turned back off because whoever turned it on knew that that was going to wake up whoever was in the house. Melissa doesn't know what to do. Before, whatever the heck was happening in her house was a little bit subtle. It was like she had to think about what she was hearing to confirm it was actually happening. Now, this person is just strolling into her house in the middle of the night and flipping on the TV and blaring it through the house. And so she immediately is like, oh my God, what do I do? And she picks up her phone and she calls her brother. And he picks up right away and she goes, someone is in the house right now. The brother's like, I will be there in 10 minutes. Do not leave your bedroom. Don't do anything. Stay on the phone with me. So Melissa's shaking out of fear and she gets up as slowly as she can and she walks over to the window to get as far away from the door, which was locked, as she possibly could. And she's glancing out the window, waiting to see her brother pull up as she listens for any sign that this person downstairs has begun walking upstairs. Finally, Melissa sees out of the corner of her eye her brother's car pulls up across the street, and he, along with her younger brother, hop out. They run across the street towards her house. They hop over the fence and they run down the alley between her house and her neighbors, and they go towards the back out of sight. She's still on the phone with him and she's saying, do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? And he says, hold on. He goes to the back of the house where he knows you can look in and basically see the whole first floor. And as soon as he gets to that spot where she's expecting him to give her a report, and he pauses, there's silence on the phone, and she goes, what do you see? And he says, okay, yep, there is someone in your living room right now. I'm going to hang up and call the police, and I'm going to call you right back. Now, Melissa knew what she heard was very real to her, but to have it confirmed by her brother right now took this to a whole nother level of fear. Now she's legitimately fearing for her life. There is a person, an intruder in my house right now, confirmed. They are right downstairs and they've been coming into my house probably for weeks. And so her brother hangs up the phone and begins calling the police. Meanwhile, Melissa is just standing in this room, horrified as she listens to a stranger walk around the first floor of her house. But because she was hearing the footsteps clearly downstairs, she decided she would just walk over to her door and look through the keyhole, which was oversized on her door. And if you look through it and over to the left, you'd actually look downstairs to the first floor. You'd only see a sliver of the first floor. And so very carefully, she walks her way over to the door. And as she kneels down to look through the keyhole, her phone rings. It was in her pocket and it wasn't on silent. It was on loud, and it was her brother calling back. And she kind of fumbles for her phone. She drops it on the ground. It's still ringing, and she finally silences it. And then reflexively, she pokes her head back and looks through the keyhole, and standing at the bottom of the stairs looking up at her is a man with a hat pulled over his eyes who's clearly heard the sound, and he begins walking up the stairs. She's falling over backwards, screaming at the top of her lungs to get her brothers inside. She hears them come charging inside. She hears this epic struggle on the stairs, and she hears this person who's in her house, because it was a voice she didn't recognize, screaming, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." And then it's quiet. And so she opens that door because she wants to help if she can. And she looks and she sees her brothers have this man pinned on the stairs. He's not moving. And she sees her younger brother is holding something. And he holds it up to her and he just shakes his head, and it's a frickin' knife. And then she puts it together that the stranger in her house was carrying this knife. And before she can even take that information in, the older brother takes the hat off of this guy, and it's their mother's ex-boyfriend from 10 years ago. The same one they all believed had an inappropriate attraction to Melissa. Police show up and take him away, and he quickly admitted to sneaking into her house for months. They don't know how he got in, and he would never tell them, but he admitted that, yep, I was breaking in almost every single night. But he never gave a good reason why. He just started doing it. Police cited mental illness as the likely culprit for why he was doing it, and the family believed this could be something more sinister, but either way, he was given 3 years in jail, and the family, once again, cut all ties with him. In February of 2013, a young woman named Kim finally moved out of her parents' house, and she moved into this tiny little apartment that she absolutely loved. Kim had severe social anxiety. She could not stand being out in public, talking to people she didn't know. And so she would do everything in her power to stay indoors. She had a job that didn't require her to travel. And so having this little apartment was like her little oasis. When she was there, she was safe. If she had to leave, she was practically running to her car and running back so she didn't have to talk to anybody. In those first few weeks she was living there, as much as she tried to avoid all contact with other people, there was one person she was kind of forced to have an interaction with, and that was her landlord. But her landlord turned out to be this awesome old woman named Olivia, who really took a liking to Kim and kind of looked at Kim as like her daughter. And Kim was surprised at herself for wanting to interact with Olivia. She was very comforting, and she was this really nice lady. And so even though they didn't actually interact that much, they developed this relationship where Olivia liked to make food, and she'd come over to Kim's door and she'd knock and she'd leave it outside of her door, and she didn't expect Kim to come out and talk to her. She knew Kim was uncomfortable being out in public, and so she didn't push her to do that. Instead, she just expected her to eat some nice food, and whenever Kim was done eating, to put her dishes back outside the door, and Olivia would take it up and she would go clean it, and that was that. And so Kim really grew to love Olivia and was very happy to have her there. It was like she made her feel safe. 2 months after moving into this tiny little new apartment, Kim started taking a new medication for her anxiety. Now, historically, she had taken a whole bunch of different medications and knew when you start a new one, it's not uncommon to have a whole bunch of side effects that you're just not used to, and they're kind of awful, and you need some time to get used to them. So at the same time she's taking this new medication, she starts to notice that she's forgetting things. Things in her apartment are being put in places she does not remember putting them. And things are going missing and she can't remember where she put them. And so even though she was expecting side effects from this new drug, she was really frustrated with the memory loss. She also noticed this medication made her exceptionally drowsy, to the point where most days she had to take a nap for 2 or 3 hours in the middle of the day just to get through the day. Because Kim had such intense anxiety about being out in public, she did not want to go to the doctors to get a different prescription or to even talk to the doctor about, is this normal? Because that doctor's visit would necessitate a whole bunch of interactions with people she doesn't want to interact with. And so she decided, you know what? I'm just going to take my medication. I'm going to let myself adjust to this new normal, and everything will be just fine. During the time period that she's experiencing all these side effects that she is attributing to her new medication, she got a delivery from Olivia. It was a Greek salad that she knew Kim loved, and Kim's psyched about this Greek salad. She brings it in her apartment, and she decides, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to have a nice day to myself. I'm going to go in my bedroom. I'm going to turn on Netflix, and and I'm gonna eat this salad in bed. It's gonna be awesome. And so she's sitting in bed, she's eating her salad, she's watching Portlandia, and then she falls asleep right in the middle. Like as she's eating her salad, she's falling asleep. She's so tired. When she woke up, she's like, wow, I've never fallen asleep that hard and that fast before. And she's literally still got the fork in her hand from eating her salad. And then she notices on the other side of the bed, the left side of the bed, the sheets are all disturbed, like someone has been laying there. And Kim always sleeps on the right side of the bed. It was almost like a compulsion for Kim that she could never sleep on the left side, like it was bad luck. And she reaches her hand out and she feels that side of the bed where it's been disturbed and it's still warm. And so she quickly thinks to herself, well, I guess I must have rolled over and laid on that side of the bed and then rolled back to this side, just miraculously right back in the same position I was in with the salad fork still in hand. And that's when it kind of clicks in her head, like, that's not possible. That's not possible. So what does that mean? Does that mean someone's in my apartment right now? And so she leaps out of bed, she gets her phone, she enters 911 and she's ready to dial it, and she flips on all the lights in her apartment, she's running around and there's no one in her apartment. The apartment's still locked, everything is normal. And so she puts her phone away and her heart's still racing. She's very stressed out about what's just occurred. Because in her mind, in the back of her mind anyways, she knows she didn't roll over. That didn't happen. This is when Kim began to wonder, are all these strange happenings in my apartment connected to what just happened now? Because this incident right here does not feel medication side effect driven. And so all of a sudden she's looking at the other weird things in her apartment, like the missing toothbrush and the missing shoes and things getting moved around, as suddenly connected. And it dawns on her that maybe she's been blind to something else happening. Maybe someone is breaking into my apartment. So for the next couple of days, Kim watched her apartment like a hawk to see if there was any indication of somebody breaking into her apartment at any point. And there was nothing. She always locked the door. She always kept the windows shut. The only thing that stood out to her was when she woke up in the mornings, her bedroom had a very distinctive smell to it. It wasn't her smell, and it wasn't a smell she was used to. It was like another person's smell, and it really freaked her out. She decided, it's time to tell my parents. And so when she tells her parents and she's describing out loud what's been going on in her apartment, it's the first time she's hearing herself say this stuff out loud. And it sounds way more creepy and way more scary than it did in her own head. And so as she's telling them, she's becoming scared to go back to her apartment. And her dad picks up on that and says, hey, I'll go back with you. We'll look around your apartment and we'll make sure it's safe and secure. And then on the way out, we'll check in with your landlady and we'll let her know what's going on. So she's brought in and everything's going to be fine. They go back to her apartment, they go inside, and when they walk in, everything looks normal. They kind of do a walk through the apartment, looks normal. But before her dad leaves, he says, hey, let me just do a closer inspection of your whole apartment. Let me look everywhere and make sure there's not like some special way to get in here, just to give you peace of mind. And so he went into her bedroom and he starts looking around and he's lifting up the mattress and looking underneath. And then he opens up her closet, which is this big closet, lots of clothes in there. It's not quite a walk-in closet, but it's big enough that you can easily stand in there. And her father reaches in and splits the clothes and he uses his light to look at all of the back wall. And he pushes on it and he taps on it and he sees if there's any sort of special compartment. There's not. But before he walks out again, he notices a little blurb of writing on the bottom right corner of the inner wall, an area that you could only see if you were standing in the closet looking for strange things on the wall of the inside of this closet. He kneels down to take a look at it, and it's this little tiny blurb of text that says, come back here so I can look at you. And the only way you could write it is if you were laying down in this tiny little corner facing the exit of the closet. And that's when her father looks at the bottom of the closet and one of the slats on the closet door was missing. And so in theory, if you were someone that was writing this message, you'd be laying down where your eyes would be looking through that slat right at her bed. Her father put it together and he stood up. He walked out to his daughter and he said, come over here. He showed her what's in her closet and he said, did you write that? And she goes, no. And he goes, all right, it's time to leave. They walk outside, they go to his truck, and he calls the police and he says, someone's breaking into my daughter's apartment. Police show up and using CCTV footage, they capture a grown man regularly going into Kim's apartment in the middle of the night, and he clearly has a key. It would turn out to be Olivia's grown adult son named Henry, who lived with her, who apparently, as soon as he saw Kim for the first time, he fell madly in love with her and became very obsessed with her. And he developed this fake relationship in his mind where he believed he and Kim were dating, even though Kim didn't even know Henry existed. She didn't even know he was living with Olivia. She had never seen him before. During questioning, Henry said what he did is he got sleeping pills and he ground them up, and anytime his mother was delivering food to Kim, which she loved to do, and she was always excited about it, so she was talking about it so he would know it was happening, he would put sleeping pills in her food, he would mix it in, and then he knew as soon as it was delivered, she would be asleep. And he would use his mother's spare key to go into the apartment, and what he said he did is he never touched her. He never laid a hand on Kim. Instead, he laid next to her in bed or watched her from inside the closet. So for the 4 months that Kim lived in this apartment, where she believed every time she came inside and shut the doors that she was kind of away from society, she could just be alone in her bubble, well, in reality, there was some psychopath just a few feet away from her almost the entire time. When Olivia found out about all of this, she made a point to tell Kim she had nothing to do with it and she was terribly sorry, but their friendship ended. On October 17th, 1941, 73-year-old Philip Peters was supposed to join his friends for dinner, but he never showed up. His neighbors knew Phil was living alone at the time because his wife had recently fallen and broken her hip and was in the hospital. And so they were worried about Phil being on his own, and they thought, you know what, let's just be sure, let's call the police and have them go over and check on him. When the police arrived at his house, they knocked on the door, no answer. They tried the door handle, it was locked. They tried the other door, that was locked too. They looked in the windows, it was all dark, and they had to get another neighbor who had a key to open the door for them. When they stepped inside, there was blood everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, everywhere. And in the middle of the kitchen is Phil Peters, face down. He has been bludgeoned to death. The police immediately draw their weapons and they're looking around the house thinking someone could still be here. And they clear the whole house and there's no one there. And so a whole bunch of detectives converge on the house and they start investigating. And they realize pretty quickly how strange the scene was. Nothing in the house was vandalized. Nothing in the house was stolen. And Phil himself was just a very modest, retired auditor. He certainly didn't have any enemies, and so the revenge angle didn't necessarily make much sense. But then you got to remember that when police first got there before they discovered his body, the house was shut and locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. And so whoever was in there with Phil at the time of his death must have known Phil enough to have a key of their own or have Phil open the door for them. So it made investigators wonder what would motivate some person that's in Phil's inner circle to commit such a heinous crime when the obvious angles, such as theft, vandalism, revenge, have basically been crossed off. Not to mention, there was virtually no evidence of who could have done this, with the exception of the murder weapon, which was this big piece of metal called a stove shaker. But the person who had used it to kill him had taken the time to meticulously wipe it off. So there was nothing on it, no fingerprints, no anything. So for months, detectives agonized over this case, but they got nowhere. 9 months later, a housekeeper was hired by Phil's widow to help around the house now that Phil was gone. And she said as soon as she moved in, she started hearing strange tapping sounds all through the house, but didn't think anything of it. And so that day, the day she's calling police, she's alone in the Peters residence and she hears the tapping and it's coming from the kitchen. And she thinks, oh, it's got to be a woodpecker just outside the house, outside the window. And she said as she looked into the kitchen, on the other side of the kitchen was a door that opened up to a flight of stairs that went to the second floor. And she said it was slowly opening. And out from behind comes this white hand that reaches for the side of the door and begins to pull it open. And she screams and the hand retracts back into the space. And then she hears it storm up the stairs and run around on the upstairs before going silent again. She ran out of the house and she ran to a neighbor's house to call the police. The police immediately go to the house and they go inside, guns drawn, and they're looking for this person because they're thinking perhaps the murderer is back. And they're looking all through the house and there's nothing. There's not even a sign of a break-in. And so the police go back to the housekeeper and to Miss Peters. They explain that we couldn't find anyone, but given the history of your house, we don't think it's safe for you to be in there. And so the housekeeper didn't go back and Miss Peters was moved back to the hospital where she could be looked after during the police investigation. At this point, the police decide we're going to permanently stake out this house. We're going to have 2 detectives that are outside this house watching it at all times. And so two detectives go and they're sitting outside, and for a couple of days they're not seeing anything, they're not hearing anything, and they decide to just go inside and have a look around. They both walk into the house, they go upstairs, they look around, they don't see anything, they go back downstairs, and as they're standing on the first floor getting ready to leave, they hear what sounds like a doorknob turning upstairs. They both heard it, so they go upstairs and they start searching different rooms, and one of the detectives goes into the bedroom and opens up a closet, and past all the clothes, bottom left-hand corner, he sees a foot dart into a little space in the back corner of the closet. And without any hesitation, this guy jumps head first into the closet and grabs the foot of this mystery person who's crawling into a tiny little panel in the back of a closet. And he holds on to this person who's fighting with their life to get away, and he starts pulling them out, and he's yelling for his partner to come over. He comes charging in. They both grab this person and they yank this person out, and they would describe him as the strangest looking person they had ever seen. He was super tall but rail thin, and his skin was so dirty it appeared gray. His name was Theodore Conies, and he had been living in this house for a year. Before Conies moved in, he had fallen on hard times. He was sleeping in alleyways, and as it started to get colder in September of 1941, he decided he would approach his longtime friend Phil Peters, and he would ask him for some money and maybe an opportunity to crash at his house for a couple of days. But as it happened, when he got to Phil's house, Phil wasn't there. Phil was at the hospital visiting his wife who had a broken hip. And so the house was vacant. And Conies saw an opportunity and he broke in. And at first his plan was just to steal food, get warmed up a little bit, and then leave. But he noticed when he was looking through the house for things to take that in the back of one of these closets was a panel that led to this tiny little almost secret attic space that wasn't being used for anything because it was impossibly small. You'd have to be incredibly skinny just to get through the little square opening that would bring you into this little space. And then once you got in, you could only get in by slithering headfirst in. You couldn't stand up. You had to be laying the entire time. You couldn't extend your legs all the way if you're a full-grown adult. So you're kind of tucked up in almost like a pseudo-fetal position. But Conies saw this as a huge upgrade from living on the streets, and he decided that this is where he's going to live for the winter. And so he went around the house gathering supplies between blankets and food and water, and he filled his tiny little space. And then he went back downstairs and he locked the front door again, made sure everything looked the way it was when he showed up. And he went into his little space and shut the door behind him. And when Phil came home that night, he didn't notice anything. And for the next several weeks, Phil never noticed a thing. Every time Phil would leave, Conies would sneak out, go downstairs, make himself some coffee, get a bite to eat, then go back up to his little space. He even cut into the house's wiring system and stole one of Phil's radios, brought it into the cubby with him, attached it to the new wiring, and he got to listen to the news so he didn't feel so isolated from the outside world. But about a month later, Conies leaves his little spot to go downstairs because he thinks Phil is gone. He gets to the kitchen, he's going through the fridge. When he shuts the fridge, he looks over and there's Phil standing there looking at him like, "What are you doing in my kitchen?" In a panic, Conies grabs the stove shaker and beats Phil to death. Not knowing what else to do, he wipes off the murder weapon, leaves it where it is. He goes in the fridge, he gets some more food and drink, and he goes right back up to where he lives. He would follow the investigation of Phil Peters' death on his radio, curled up inside of Phil Peters' house. Conies was quickly found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. After hearing his sentence read to him, he says out loud, "Now I feel safe. I'll have a better home than I've had in years." So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. And if you found today's secret, please let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. The first one to do that will get pinned. If you enjoyed the video today and you haven't done this already, please offer the like button a beer, but then give them an O'Doul's. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. While he was in college at Carnegie Mellon University, Aaron Ralston studied mechanical engineering, French, and piano, and then upon graduation, he moved to the Southwest and took a job as an engineer. But 5 years into his corporate job, he realized he hated it, and so he quit and moved to Colorado to pursue his real passion in life, which was mountain climbing. On April 25th, 2003, Ralston takes a trip to Utah where he plans to explore the Canyonlands National Park. He slept in his truck that night, and the next morning at about 9:15 a.m., he gets up, and it's this beautiful Saturday morning. He hops on his bike, and he bikes 15 miles to Blue John Canyon. The canyon was an 11-mile gorge that at certain places was as narrow as 3 feet across. And so Aaron locks up his bike and he begins walking through this canyon. About 6 hours later at 2:45 p.m., Aaron is right at this section of the gorge that's getting really, really narrow, and below him is about 100 feet down to the bottom of the desert floor. He was going to walk with both feet on either wall because it was so narrow and kind of Spider-Man his way through this section of the canyon. But as he began that maneuver, a huge 800-pound boulder became dislodged above him, and it comes tumbling down, and he barely gets out of the way, but it lands on his arm, and it pins his arm against the wall, and he can't move, and he's suspended 100 feet off the ground, and he's 20 miles away from the nearest paved road. Immediately, he tries to pull his hand free and push the rock off, but it's not going anywhere. And that's when it dawns on him that he didn't tell anybody he was going to be in this gorge today. No one knows he's here, and he's so far away from anyone that can help him, and he doesn't have a cell phone, he doesn't have a radio, he's got no way to communicate with anyone who could potentially help him. Now, the position he was in was not him dangling by his arm 100 feet off the ground. He was able to position himself against the rocks where he wasn't dangling. He was able to sit fairly comfortably besides his arm being crushed, and he was able to use the rock that actually had pinned him there as a sort of table or something to lean up against. And after he calms down a little bit, after a few minutes, he reaches back and he pulls his bag out in front and he starts taking inventory of what he has. And all he had was 12 ounces of water, so just a single water bottle, and he had 2 burritos and some candy bar crumbs. That was all he had. In terms of tools, all he had was this crummy multi-tool, and it did have a little knife that extended off the end, and almost immediately he takes that multi-tool and begins chopping away at this boulder to try to see if he can maybe crack it and push half of it off. But he's finding out very quickly that it's completely futile. It is not moving. It is an enormous boulder. It's not going anywhere. He cannot possibly break it with this crappy little multi-tool. As the sun began to set, Aaron started thinking really seriously about trying to cut his arm off. But again, all he has is this multi-tool and this crappy little dull knife, and he's thinking there's no way I can cut through my arm. There's bone in there. I can't possibly saw through the bone. And so very disheartened, he puts his multi-tool away and he begins to nurse the water and slowly eat the food and thinks maybe some miracle will happen where over the next couple of days, someone will be within earshot. I can yell to them and they can come get me, or maybe someone will see me when they're hiking overhead. I can just wait it out. But by the 5th day, he had run out of water. He was becoming delirious. He was actually drinking his own urine at this point, and he expected to die overnight. And so with his multi-tool, he etched his name into the rock, and then underneath it, he etched the date he expected to die, which was the next day. And then after that, he put his multi-tool down, and he did have a camera with limited battery, and he pulled that out, and selfie style, he filmed goodbyes to his family.
My name's Aaron Ralston. My parents are down on Larry Ralston of Englewood, Colorado. Whoever finds this, please make an attempt to get it to them. Be sure of it. I would appreciate it.
After he was done filming, he put the camera away and he leaned up against the rock and fully expected to die. But he starts to have this really intense dream where he sees himself playing with a child and he's missing his right arm. And he takes that as a sign that he's supposed to chop his arm off and get out of here alive and go start a family. And so he wakes up from this dream and suddenly all he wants to do is survive. And he looks at his arm, which is already starting to decompose at this point, and he thinks to himself, I know I can't cut through bone, but what if I'm able to break my arm clean through? I can take this blade and cut through the break in the bone. And so he began testing using the edge of the rock as a fulcrum to see if he'd be able to break his arm, using the torque of pushing it over the edge of the rock. And when he started to sense it was possible, he took a deep breath and then he broke his arm. He takes his multi-tool, and over the next hour, he would painstakingly saw through his entire arm. Once his arm was free, he couldn't believe it. He actually smiled when he saw his arm still pinned underneath the rock because of his sheer will to live at this point. And high on adrenaline, he climbed the 65 feet out of this canyon with his one arm. He gets to the trail and he runs 6 miles, and he happens to run into a group of hikers. They give him food and water and they're totally alarmed by him, but they're happy to help him. They call 911 and medics arrive and they save Aaron's life. Following Aaron Ralston's rescue, they went back to retrieve his arm. But in order to move that boulder, they had to bring out 13 park rangers, a hydraulic jack, and a winch, and all this heavy equipment, and they were barely able to move it. And they told Aaron, had you still been in place, there's no way we could have placed the equipment without killing you. So basically, you had to cut your arm off in order to get out of there. There was no other way out. And so for Aaron, I'm sure that felt pretty good to feel like you cut your arm off and that was the right decision. They would take his arm and they would cremate it and give the ashes to Aaron. And Aaron, after having his cremated arm for a couple of days, decided, no, I need to put this where it belongs. And so Aaron went back out to the canyon where he had been trapped, and he scattered his ashes over the boulder that had nearly killed him. In 2010, Aaron's ordeal was turned into a huge blockbuster movie called 127 Hours, where James Franco plays Aaron Ralston in the movie, and it's an incredible movie, albeit it's pretty hard to watch. Aaron Ralston himself said the movie, although it's a drama, is pretty much a documentary because James Franco does an incredible job portraying his emotions and what it was actually like to be trapped underneath this boulder for 5 days. In 1984, 19-year-old Timothy Molnar was living at home with his parents in Daytona Beach, Florida, while going to school for aeronautical mathematics. On January 24th, Timothy gets up and begins his day just like every other day of the work week, by going downstairs, having a bite to eat, and then taking his younger brother Frank to school. Once he dropped Frank off, he drove across town to his university where he had class, but as soon as he parked, he realized he had forgotten his bike, and that was something he brought with him everywhere. And so before class started, he went back home, he got his bike, put it in his car, turned around and headed out, and his mother would step outside and see him trailing away down the road, and that was the last time she, or anybody in their family for that matter, saw him alive. That night, when Tim didn't come home, his family called the police. The police asked them, is there any reason he would want to run away? Is he in trouble? Is there anything going on? And his family's like, no, he's a straight-A student. He's got lots of friends. He's super happy. He's well-adjusted. He's on a great career path. There's nothing in his life to indicate that he would want to run away or that he's in trouble. I know he doesn't drink or do drugs. There's really nothing. So the police begin their investigation, and they start by looking at the family's credit card bills because they knew Tim had a credit card that was connected to the family account. And they found there had been a charge placed the same day he had gone missing in a gas station about 150 miles away. And so the police go out to this gas station and they find someone that had been there when Tim was there, and he was able to describe exactly what he looked like, what his car looked like. And the police ask him, was Tim alone? And the witness says, yeah, he was alone. He was acting totally normal. I saw him go into the store and then I saw him come back out again, and that was it. I don't know where he went after the gas station. So for the next couple of days, nothing really happened. There were no leads to operate on, and Tim wasn't getting in touch with them, so they just waited. Then on January 30th, so about a week after Tim has gone missing, Tim's family receives a letter from an auto impound company in Atlanta, Georgia. And the letter basically says, there is a car that's sitting in our lot that is registered to your house. You need to come out here and get it. And so the family goes to Atlanta, Georgia to inspect the car, and they walk up to it and there's nothing suspicious about it. There's no scratches on it. The tires are all fully inflated. They look inside and there's no sign of a struggle. There's no blood. There's no debris of any kind. But what they would find inside the car were Tim's credit cards, his wallet, his license, and other items suggesting that perhaps Tim is trying to ditch his old identity and start a new one. They also noticed a few very expensive items that they knew were always in his car were now missing. His car stereo, his toolbox, and his bike. Tim's family stayed in Atlanta for a couple of days thinking maybe Tim will return to this car, but after a couple of days it was clear that they weren't doing any good sitting there, so they went back to Florida. When they got back, they looked inside of Tim's room a little bit more closely and they discovered that none of his clothes had been taken. There was no suitcase taken. It was like he left with just the clothes on his back. They also checked his savings account and he had taken all the money out but left $10 in there. And the family believed that by leaving that $10, what he was really saying is, I'm gonna come back someday. But he didn't come back, and they never ever heard about him again. It was like he just vanished. A decade after Tim went missing, the TV show Unsolved Mysteries aired a segment about Timothy and his disappearance in hopes that the viewers would be able to give them some information about the case. And sure enough, a man named Stephen Cull, who was living in Wisconsin, called into the show and said, without a doubt, I know where Timothy is. He told them this story about how 10 years earlier, he was walking around this forested area in Wisconsin when he came to a clearing in the middle of this forest, and he saw this lump in the middle of the ground. And he didn't know what it was. It was wintertime, so he couldn't tell if it was wood or an animal. And he walked up to it and he looked down and he realized it was this huge block of ice. And when he brushed the snow off the top, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Inside of this huge block of ice is the dead body of a young man. Cull would immediately call the police, who would show up. They would get the body out of the ice, but there was no identifying information on him, and he was very badly decomposed at this point, and so they had no way to identify him, and so he was buried and he was unclaimed. But from the second Steve saw that dead body in the ice, that image was seared into his mind. And so when the TV show Unsolved Mysteries put a picture of Tim up on the screen saying, if you've seen this guy, let us know, Steven's like, oh my gosh, I recognize those clothes. That's the guy who was dead in the ice block. And so the police go to Wisconsin, they dig up the body that was inside at the ice, they do a DNA test, and sure enough, it's Tim Molnar. Even though Tim's body was almost completely skeletonized at this point, the coroner said there's no sign of trauma to his body, none. However, they weren't able to determine a cause of death. To this day, we have no idea how or why Tim wound up 1,200 miles away, frozen inside of a block of ice. In 2009, 25-year-old Larry Mario Moncada graduated from college and moved back in with his parents in Iowa. He was excited about his future, and his parents were extremely proud of him. As soon as Larry moved back home, the first thing he did was go out and get a placeholder job at the No Frills supermarket, which was a local supermarket right in town. He figured, you know what, it's temporary, but I don't want to just sit around all day. I want to do that until I find my career. But even though the job was supposed to be temporary, he found that he kind of loved the job because he loved the people he worked with, and his coworkers would later say that they loved working with him too. But everything in Larry and his family's life would get turned completely upside down in November of 2009. On November 26th, while a blizzard raged outside, Larry and his family celebrated Thanksgiving inside. After everyone was done eating, Larry told them that he actually had an overnight shift at the supermarket. And I don't think his family knew he had this shift. So they were like, oh man, do you really gotta go? The weather's so bad. And he's like, no, I gotta go. I don't mind. And they're like, all right, well, hey, sorry you gotta work. And Larry walks outside and goes to work. The next morning when he came back from that shift, his mother would say something seemed off about him. When he came inside, he was very disoriented. He didn't really know where he was. And his mom's trying to tell him that everything's okay. You know, what's going on? Did something happen out there? And this is when it dawned on her that he could be having an anxiety attack. Just a few years earlier, Larry had had a whole bunch of panic attacks and he was really struggling with anxiety. And it wasn't until his mom made him go to the doctor and put him on medication that he stabilized. But at this moment, she didn't know if her son was on any medication or not. So just to play it safe, she said, hey, let's go to the doctor and have you looked at. You don't seem well. So she brings him to the doctor and the doctor quickly prescribes Larry an antidepressant. They go and fill the prescription, they go back home, and Larry takes one of these antidepressants. But the medication didn't seem to be doing anything because over the course of the day, Larry got progressively more and more stressed out and more confused seeming. And eventually he told his mom that he was hearing voices in his head that were telling him his heart is beating too quickly and he needs to eat sugar to slow down his heart. And his mom is looking at him thinking, what do I do about this? And so all she could think to do was just to stand next to him and kind of comfort him as he sits there eating sugar over the course of the day. Finally that night he would fall asleep and his mother prayed that over the course of the night that somehow this medication he had been prescribed would kick in and he would wake up and feel better, because so far it really seemed to only be getting exponentially worse. But the next morning when Larry got up, he was just as bad as the night before, except now he was having these vivid hallucinations. He said there were people in the house that were looking for him, and so he spent the day running around the house hiding from people in the house that were not actually there. Then finally that night, Larry just kind of loses it and begins screaming at his parents and berating them, before suddenly running out the front door without shoes, without a jacket, no wallet, no cell phone, no anything. And he just runs directly into the blizzard and disappears. His family was so caught off guard by this happening that it took them a minute to get out the front door after him, but it was snowing so hard they could barely see in front of their face, and they knew he was gone. So immediately they call the police, but the police have the same issue. They can't really go looking for him right now because the visibility was so bad. And so they told his family that we can't really start until tomorrow morning, so hopefully he turns up tonight. So the next day when the weather clears up a little bit, the police go out looking for Larry, and they're asking people in town if they've seen him, and no one's seen Larry. And unfortunately, because it had snowed so much the night before, any of Larry's tracks leading out of Larry's house were now covered over. And so after a couple of days of this, when there's just no sign of this guy, the police say to the family, look, there's not much we can do. We're just going to have to wait to see if he turns up. 10 years later, the No Frills supermarket where Larry used to work was out of business and it was about to get torn down. And some contractors were sent in to start ripping down the shelving and breaking down the inside of the building. And when they went into the back and began pulling away those huge freezers that keep your milk and your dairy products in, they start pulling those away from the wall. Larry's body comes tumbling out. It had been pinned in this tiny 18-inch wide space between the back of the freezer and the wall. It's believed on the night Larry ran out of his parents' house barefoot into a blizzard, he ran right up the road and went to the No Frills supermarket. Now, it was closed at the time, but he had access to the back door with the key code because he worked there. And so he went inside and he climbed on top of the freezers, the section of the freezers that jut back into the space that no one in the store can see. And he climbed on top because on top of there, all the workers would kind of congregate up there. It was like a little clubhouse where the workers would avoid the managers for little pockets of the day. And so Larry probably climbed up there because it represented a really happy place for him. And when he got up there, he must have somehow tripped and fallen into the tiny 18-inch space between the freezer and the wall. Investigators believe there's no way he actually got hurt when he fell into this little space. He got wedged in there, but he wasn't harmed. The problem was these huge fans that run constantly to keep the freezer cold were unbelievably loud and would have completely drowned out his cries for help. And so no one knows for sure how long this took, but eventually he would die because no one heard him. Looking back at old Facebook posts around the time that Larry would have been dead behind the freezer, there was a whole bunch of people that were commenting on Facebook that they didn't want to shop at the No Frills supermarket anymore. Apparently there was a really bad smell coming out of the back freezer. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's video, in the comments section, tell us what it is and at what time we can find it. And the first person to do that will get pinned at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please point at the like button's chest and tell them they have something on their shirt. And then when they look down, flick them in the nose. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. At 3:26 a.m. on August 7th, 1985, a very distraught man called the police and he said, "I think my father is in mortal danger. He lives down the road from me. I was just on the phone with him and it seems like something is totally wrong. Can you please go check on him?" The police tell him to calm down and explain really what's going on here, what happened on the phone. And so the man, whose name was Jeremy, said his dad called him and he was talking about his daughter, so Jeremy's sister, and her name was Sheila. And he's like, "Sheila's gone crazy. She's gone berserk and I think she has a gun." And Jeremy's telling police that he didn't know what his dad was talking about and he's trying to get more information from his dad. He's like, "What do you mean she's got a gun? What's going on over there?" But at some point in this phone call with his father, the phone line just cuts out. And Jeremy's left with all these questions that have gone unanswered. He tried calling back, but it didn't go through, and that's when he called the police. The police asked Jeremy if he had heard any shots fired in the background before the phone cut out. And Jeremy says, "No, but my sister is schizophrenic, she's got a bad temper, and she had been fighting with my parents all week, in particular with my dad. And right before the phone cut out, my dad sounded really scared, like something bad was about to happen or was happening. And so we need to get over there right now." And so the police say, "Okay, we're going to check it out right now." So they hang up with Jeremy and the police head down the road towards White House Farms, where Jeremy's father lives. They park a little ways away from the house itself, safely behind a wall and some trees, because they don't want to go too close in case Sheila really does have a gun and starts shooting at them. As the police are getting out of their vehicle, another car comes driving down the road from the same direction the police had come from. The police tell them to stop and the person gets out and it turns out it's Jeremy. He didn't live that far away and he comes running over and he's like, "We got to go in there. You have to go in there right now." And the police are like, "We're not going to do that. You stay with your car." Before the police were prepared to go into this house, they wanted to scope it out and get a sense of what was going on because they really didn't know anything about the house besides what Jeremy told them. So a small group of police officers goes behind this other building that's kind of adjacent to the White House Farms, but pretty close to the actual farmhouse. and they go around the backside and they peek around the corner and they start looking at the house. And it's still dark outside, and there's a couple of lights on inside the house, and there's no movement, there's no sound, and they're just staring at it. And then one of the officers notices movement, or what he thinks is movement, up in the second floor, and the group of them back up behind the building. They didn't want to be seen. They were worried if Sheila saw them, it would trigger her to harm the other people in the house or harm herself. So they back up away from this building, making sure to stay out of sight of that second floor window and really out of sight of any of the windows on this farmhouse. And they go back to the intersection where the police cars are and where Jeremy is, and they decide they're going to take the diplomatic approach. And so they call in a negotiator who, with a bullhorn, goes up behind that little building, and they start calling out to Sheila, trying to get her to peacefully put her weapon down and come outside. But there's no sound in the house, there's no more movement in the house as far as anyone can tell, and this turns into a multi-hour long standoff where no one comes out of the house, no one goes into the house, and then the sun comes up and the police are starting to get frustrated, and so they eventually call the negotiator back and they say, okay, we're going to need to make entry. A small group of police assaulters began making their way up towards the farmhouse. They get up to the door, it's locked. They try the other door, it's locked. All the windows are locked. And so they bring up a sledgehammer, they smash on the front door, and they make entry into this hallway. They immediately make a right, and they're getting ready to confront Sheila wherever she is, but they don't see her. They go all the way down this hallway, and it opens up into the kitchen. And hunched over the stove is a man who's clearly deceased, who winds up being Jeremy's father. He had been shot to death, and he's laying in the kitchen. So they find him, they scan the rest of the kitchen, and they look all around the first floor, and there's no one else down there. And this whole time, they're not hearing any other noises in the house. It's totally silent. They make their way upstairs, and as soon as they get to the top of the stairs, they go right into the first room on the right, and laying on the bed is a deceased older woman who's also been shot to death, and that would wind up being Jeremy's mother. Laying on the ground next to the bed was a woman who appeared to be in her late 20s, who would wind up being Jeremy's sister, so Sheila, the one who had gone berserk apparently according to the father. She's laying on the ground, and she has a rifle that's over her chest, and the barrel is pointed up towards her head, and she has a gunshot wound that's going in underneath her chin, and so she's deceased as well. The police leave that room, they go across the hall into another bedroom, and when they go inside, they find two more bodies that are both laying in their beds. They were 6-year-old twins. They were Sheila's sons. They had both been shot to death as well. After that, there was nobody else in the house, so all of the family has been wiped out. Very quickly, this case was labeled a clear-cut murder-suicide perpetrated by Sheila. She had a history of mental illness, she had apparently gone berserk that night, and she had a gun, everything fit. And so the police were ready to just write this off as a murder-suicide, especially with the amount of media attention this case got. There was a lot of pressure to just solve this case and move on. And so murder-suicide became the answer, and they were not looking for any other answer. But there was one detective that was not willing to accept that this was clearly a murder-suicide, and he had a couple reasons for it. The first thing he noticed, because he was there when the bodies were discovered, was Sheila was carrying a rifle that had a 10-round magazine, and Sheila did not have any pockets on the clothes she had on when they found her. That's important because she fired 25 shots. So that required 2 reloads, except the ammunition to this gun was downstairs, and a lot of the shooting happened upstairs. So after her first volley of fire on the second floor, where presumably you have at least a couple people that are still totally alive, she had to walk downstairs, reload the gun, come back upstairs, do her second volley of fire, go back downstairs, reload that second time, and then she finishes her course of fire. And it made him wonder, why didn't anybody try to stop her while she was doing the reload? Because it required going all the way down, getting the rounds, jamming them into the magazine, putting it into the gun, and then going back upstairs. That's a lot of time that other people could have potentially tried to stop her, or at a minimum, just tried to escape. But it was like everybody just laid in bed. It was like they didn't know what was happening despite so many rounds being fired very close to them. Stan also found out Sheila did not have extensive weapons training. And so she wouldn't be natural at reloading a weapon. And so for her to go down and reload twice and not chip any of her nails, she had long painted nails, that seemed like a bit of a stretch. Because that requires pretty coordinated movements. And for her to never have done that before and just to be able to easily reload, that seems like a stretch too. Stan also figured out there was a window that had a faulty latch on it, that if you pulled lightly on it, it would stay locked. But if you pulled hard and kind of jostled it around, it could open and it could shut, which means the house was not secure when they got there, even though they thought it was. And that was a big part of their whole, this is a murder-suicide, because Sheila locked all the doors and windows before she committed this crime. But if any of those doors or windows were open, it kind of leaves open the opportunity for someone else to have gotten in there and gotten out before the police. But the biggest discovery by far that puts all the others to shame is something Stan found under the stairs inside the house. And everything before that, all the evidence that Stan was presenting to the other officers saying, hey, we should take a look at this. I don't know if this is a murder-suicide. I think there might be potential for somebody else to be responsible. Well, no one was taking him seriously until he came to the table with what he found underneath the stairs. Everybody had to stop what they were doing and say, okay, yeah, we need to look closer at this. And so if you want to learn more about that, go ahead and click on the link inside of the description. It will bring you to the landing page where you can watch this series that I've been raving about. It's on HBO Max and it's called The Murders at the White House Farm. And it does a great job of showcasing this huge find and then the follow-on plot twist. On the morning of November 13th, 1974, 6 members of the DeFeo family were asleep in their home in Amityville, New York. The 7th member of the family, Ron, was sitting on his bed in the basement. At around 1 a.m., he gets up off his bed, he grabs a rifle, and he starts walking up the stairs. He goes across the first floor, goes up the second floor stairs, and he gets to the second floor landing, and he walks right into his parents' bedroom, which was totally dark besides this little candle that had been lit next to his father's bedside. And he raises his rifle and he puts 2 rounds into his father's back. And then as soon as his father is still, he aims at his mother and he shoots her 2 times. And then he puts the gun down and he walks out and he goes across the hall into his brother's room. He raises his rifle and he fires 1 shot into his 12-year-old brother Mark, and then he aims at his 9-year-old brother John and he fires 1 shot into him as well. Then he leaves their bedroom and he walks down the hall to another bedroom where he finds his 13-year-old sister Allison. He raises his rifle and he fires 1 shot. He leaves her room, he goes up the 3rd set of stairs up onto the 3rd floor. He finds his 18-year-old sister Dawn and he fires 1 shot into her, and then he was done. Altogether, it took Ron about 15 minutes to massacre his family. At no point was he panicked or running around or acting crazy. He was just walking calmly room to room, taking very well-aimed shots to ensure they didn't get up again. He put the rifle down and he went outside and he jogged to a bar where he went inside and he put on this big facade that he had just found his family and they were hurt and could you come help him? And when they got to the house, he refused to go inside, but the people from the bar went inside and they discovered this horrible scene. And when the police show up, Ron goes over to them and he actually confesses and says, I killed my family. Even though the DeFeo family had a reputation for being very dysfunctional, it was Ron who had the worst reputation. He was known around Amityville for heavy drug use, for being a total alcoholic, and for getting really aggressive and confrontational with people. He was just a guy no one wanted to be around. And so when news got out in Amityville that this horrible thing has happened, and it looks like Ron is the one who did it, no one was really that shocked. But when details of the crime scene, specifically the way the bodies were positioned, made people wonder, is there more to this case that we don't know about? All of the DeFeo family members had been found lying face down in their beds, and none of them showed any signs of putting up a struggle against their attacker, which led investigators initially to think that they must have been sedated, that Ron must have drugged them somehow before he carried out this attack. But when the toxicology reports came back, no one in the family had any substance in their system. At first, the police did not think that was a very big deal. They figured, you know what? The family just must not have heard the different gunshots. He wasn't shooting lots of rounds. It was, 1 single round here, 1 single round here, that perhaps they just didn't hear it, and that's why no one tried to escape. But it turns out the rifle Ron was using, the .35 caliber Marlin, is one of the loudest rifles you can own. And in fact, investigators went out and did a test with it, and they fired it indoors, and you could easily hear it a mile away. And so investigators said, well, then it looks like they must have heard these gunshots, but for some reason, didn't get out of their beds. They didn't try to fight back in any way. They just kind of took it. And then you have the weirdness of Ron's confession. On the night of the attack, when Ron is sitting on his bed and he can't sleep and everybody else is asleep upstairs, he starts hearing a voice in his head that's saying,
"Catch them, kill them."
And he thinks he's just losing his mind. But then out of the shadows, straight across from him, from underneath the steps in the basement, this shadowy figure emerges and starts walking towards him, and he can see what looks like its mouth moving and saying the words,
"Catch them, kill them."
And Ron's looking up at it as this figure walks all the way up to him and bends down and gets right next to his ear. And he says right into his ear,
"Catch them, kill them."
And then Ron said involuntarily he reached over to the rifle that was on the bed with him, and he stood up and he began walking towards the steps. And he knew what was going to happen. He was going to go kill his family, and he didn't want to do it, but he felt like he didn't have any more control over his body. And that's when he realized he was being possessed by this demon in the basement. While Ron's confession terrified everybody in Amityville, the idea that there was a demon living in the basement of this house that possessed someone to go kill their family, I mean, that terrified everybody, but it didn't hold up in court, and ultimately Ron was sent to jail for life. 1 year after the attacks, another family, the Lutz family, moved into the house in Amityville, but they left 28 days later because they were hearing voices coming from the basement. After hearing about the mass murder that occurred in the house, and now the Lutz family saying that there's something in the basement, world-renowned demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren, they descend on the property, and very quickly Ed and Lorraine say, yes, this house is definitely haunted. And in fact, to this day, the Amityville house is considered one of the most haunted places in the entire world. But while Ed and Lorraine were there, they took a very famous picture. Lorraine was walking around the second floor near where the brothers' room was, and she was snapping pictures. And the only people in the house at the time these pictures were being taken were her and her husband, Ed. And here is the picture that she took on the second floor. She claims this boy standing on the left side of the picture is the ghost of John DeFeo. Today, the house still stands, and it's been bought and sold a number of times over the years because apparently no one likes to live in this house for a very long time. On June 10th, 1912, the Moore family was sleeping peacefully in their beds on their quiet street in Villisca, Iowa. Joe and Sarah Moore, the mother and the father, were asleep upstairs in their room, and their 4 children were down the hall in another room. In addition to the Moore family sleeping upstairs, there was also 2 more children sleeping on the first floor in the guest room. It was the Stillinger sisters, and they were over for a sleepover. And unbeknownst to all the sleeping people in the house, there was a strange man who had broken into the house while they were at church, gone into the attic, and was hiding in there, smoking cigarettes and carrying an axe. Shortly after midnight, this stranger believed the coast was clear, and they silently opened up the small door, and they crouched down and walked out of the attic into the second floor hallway, wielding this axe in their left hand. They began walking down the hallway. They passed the children's room on their right, and they made their way down to the end of the hall where the master bedroom was. They walked inside the room and stood right next to Joe, and then violently raised the axe over their head so quickly and so high that it actually struck the ceiling, and then brought it down blade first directly onto Joe's face, over and over and over again until Joe did not resemble a human being. While this was happening right next to her, Sarah's beginning to stir and look around what's going on. Meanwhile, the killer has now moved to the other side of the bed and is standing over Sarah and using the backside of the axe. So not the blade part, but the backside of the axe head. He raises it up and then brings it down on her head and repeatedly hits her over and over and over again until she too is indistinguishable and does not look like herself or even human. The killer is very calm. He takes the sheets and pulls them up over the faces of both of the people he just killed, and then he goes back out into the hall and he walks down and he goes into the children's room. One by one, he raises the axe and drops the axe on each of the children's heads, and then after they are deceased, he pulls the sheets up over their head. The killer leaves the room and goes downstairs to where the Stillinger sisters are, and then just like everybody else in the house, he raises the axe and drops it over and over and over again on the heads of each of these girls until they're no longer living as well. Afterwards, he raises the sheets over their faces, and now everyone in the house is deceased and has their face covered. At this point, the killer goes back upstairs and goes back into the master bedroom, and he stands in front of Joe and Sarah's bed, and after a little while, he begins striking them dozens more times, even though both of them were clearly deceased at this point. At this point, the killer shifted gears and began focusing on covering his tracks, cleaning up. and he began taking clothes out of closets and pulling whatever sheets he hadn't used. He began tacking these things up onto all of the windows and any spaces on the doors so that nobody could see in. He also began covering up the mirrors, which no one understood why he did that. After the house is totally covered up, the killer goes into the kitchen and he cooks himself a meal, but he doesn't eat the food. He cleaned off the axe and placed it up against the wall on the first floor. He then took a huge bowl, filled it up with water, and then washed his bloody hands and began to clean himself a little bit, and then he left the bloody water just sitting on the counter. And then, strangely, he took a huge slab of bacon from in the kitchen and he put it in the middle of the floor, and then next to it was a keychain. And some people think this might have to do with some ritual he was performing, but to this day, no one really knows why he did that. And then he took some keys from inside the house, walked out the door, turned around, locked it behind him, and disappeared. The Moore household normally was a very rambunctious place with all these kids running around, and the neighbors were very close. And so the next morning, when the neighbors did not see the Moore family coming outside to do their chores around 7 a.m., they were concerned, and they went over and they knocked on the door. There was no answer. They noticed everything had sheets over it, so they couldn't see inside. And so Joe's brother was hailed to the house, and he brought along a key, and he opened up the door and he walked inside, and he immediately saw the Stillinger sisters and what had been done to them. And he got incredibly sick, and he ran outside, and they called police. Police come down, and they find this horrible scene. Even though they have the murder weapon, they have the victims, their bodies are right here, there's blood, there's all sorts of stuff and things that the killer must have manipulated, and you would think there's enough here that you'd be able to refine your search to a couple different suspects and eventually figure out who did this, but they weren't able to. And to this day, we have no idea who did this. The house itself where the attack happened has not been updated since the attack. Somebody bought the property and then maintained it so it could be a tourist attraction. And so to this day, you can go to the Villisca axe murder house and you can stay there. You can sleep there overnight and you can actually tour the area, and it looks the same way it did when the murders happened. Many people believe that house is haunted. And in fact, in 2014, someone who was there staying overnight as a tourist inexplicably stabbed themselves and had to go to the hospital, and they don't even know why they did it. And so that's kind of added to the legend of the Villisca axe murder house, that the house itself will cause you to harm yourself. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you found the secret in today's video, please tell us in the comments what it is and where you found it. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button over to your house, and while they're sleeping, buzz a small square of their hair off. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads.